Last week when Nate was talking about me speaking this week, he said that I was a cross between Chuck Norris and Bruce Willis. And the Chuck Norris thing I really struggled with. But the Bruce Willis, like if you look, like there's some resemblance there. So I'm good with that one. Anyway. And although I can read Akkadian, I don't write Akkadian, but I do Ugaritic. So, yeah, okay. So I grew up in Eastern Washington. My father was an orchardist, and so from a very young age, I grew up working the fields. It's probably one of the reasons why I went to college at the end of that, because it was incredibly difficult work. My father loved it. We had a couple hundred acres of pears and apples. My father managed, he didn't own them. But from about age 11 on, I worked in the fields. And sometimes before school, I would have to go irrigate fields. And it, like I said, it was very difficult work. And oftentimes when we think about, like fruit and harvest and trees and all of that, we have the focus of that time in, September, October, when the trees are, laden with these beautiful red fruit. And we have no idea what it took to get to that point. And I'm telling you, we had about 35,000 trees. And for 6 months out of the year, we hand pruned every tree. We didn't actually climb in the tree like that, but I couldn't find pictures of us. But we hand pruned every single tree. And my dad had a rule that as long as it was 20 degrees or above, we had to work, right? And so if it got below 20, we didn't have to work. And this was before polypropylene, and my dad's idea of keeping our feet warm were those, I don't remember, those slip-on 6-buckle boots that really were just a rubber insulator for the cold inside. It was cold. But for 6 months, we spent hand pruning every single tree in the orchard. And then once the fruit began to bud and you would get blossoms on the fruit, the problem over in Eastern Washington, it would get cold at night. And so for about 4 weeks of the year, we had to go out. If the temperature was going to go below 32 degrees and there was no wind, we would have to go out and light these things. I still have one at my house. I kept one for posterity. They're full of diesel oil. And you would light them to raise the temperature in the orchard. Thank God they invented wind machines later on, because we would burn these or these big, massive candles in the orchard. And we would be out all night long, and then we would get to school the next morning and hopefully get a shower to get all the dirt off. And so we worked on that. And then we had to hand thin every tree. You may not know that apples are called alternate-bearing fruit. That is, if you get a really heavy crop one year and you let it sit on your tree, they won't produce as much next year. They know, I need to rest for this year and then produce again. So you would want to have a consistent amount of fruit on your trees every year. And so we hand-thinned 35,000 trees. And, it was not just us. We had people that worked with us as well. But you may not know, pears are a little easier, but when you're hand-thinning apples, if you notice, every one of those stems goes into a common spur. So if you take the stem off while you're taking one off, all of them will eventually fall off. It weakens it. So you have to actually pinch them off. So you have to hold onto the fruit and snap the stem so that the stem stays on the tree. I still do that. I have an apple tree in my yard. I hand thin my apple tree. One tree, not 35,000. But that took about 6 to 8 weeks to do that. And we would just walk through the orchard doing that. In addition to irrigating the fields, in addition to mowing the grass, fertilizing the trees, and then my favorite of all was when the fruit became heavy on these trees, and so heavy, and some of our trees are over 100 years old. When the fruit became very heavy, we had to put wood sticks under the limbs to keep them from breaking off. And that was probably about 4-week job that I just absolutely despised. Because one, no piece of wood ever fit what you were trying to do. And so either you had to cut or nail two boards together, and then you had to get underneath and force it up. And you just did that and we worked, there was no 8-hour days in the orchard. We worked from 6 to 5. And so, and you'd get, you're lucky to get a half an hour at lunch, and then you'd be back in the fields again. all of that so that hopefully, if you didn't get hail and everything else that could possibly happen. Oh, and by the way, we sprayed insecticide because there was this particular kind of bug. I didn't mention this last night. It's called Persilla, and it lives by sucking the sugar out of the leaves. And so it actually lives in a syrup. And if you've ever worked in a tree where there exists, you literally, your hair, which I had at that point, would literally just be stiff with this stuff. And then you had the harvest, 21 days. You know, we get pears are about 21 days, apples about 21 days, and that's the end. Nothing about the 10 to 11 months prior to that event. So I was thinking about that in light of the sermon here in Hebrews 12, 3 through 11, is that oftentimes when we think about the Christian life, our focus is on the end. Like, I can't wait to be with you, Jesus, right? And we completely forget about the hard work that gets us to the joy of the harvest. That joy of being with Christ in the end. And that's what the writer of Hebrews is going to be talking about today. He's going to be talking about the fact that, hey, look, this is hard work that you're going through right now. And really the question he's going to ask is, how do we make it to the end? How do we finish the race well? And again, we've been talking about this through the whole book of Hebrews. Here is a group of people, probably in Rome, who are struggling with the idea that this is tough now. This idea of Christianity is becoming too difficult. Whatever they were experiencing at this point, we get a glimpse of what they experienced prior in chapter 10, but we don't really know what's going on. But whatever they were experiencing at this point was so difficult that they were ready to jettison Christianity and go back to Judaism. And the writer has been saying all along, if you do that, like, there's no more redemption for you. And the point is, you can't stop in the middle of the race and say, I'm done. I hope that God still likes me. You've got to finish the race to get the joy of the harvest. And what he does in 3 through 11 is he's going to further explain what Nate talked about last week in chapters 1 and 2, fixing your eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of God. And then he comes back to Jesus again in chapter 12, verse 3. And the first thing he's going to say is, for consider him who has endured hostility by sinners against himself. Now, he's already mentioned that in chapter 12, verse 2, that, fixing your eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. He's coming back to that picture in verse 2 and says, look, I want you to think about this Jesus and everything that he went through. And the way it's written in the original language, it's like, I want you to do this right now. So the writer of Hebrews is telling the recipients there in Rome, I want you right now, and again, I work in the education field, right? So this is a great T-chart that I make up for kids in school, except this one is Jesus and me. Because the word consider here in the text has the idea of placing in order all of the things that I'm talking about. To consider is the counting them up or adding them up. So what he's asking the people to do is, I want you to sit down and I want you to think about everything that Jesus experienced. And again, all he said is enduring the cross, and Nate did a great job of unpacking even just a little bit of what that meant in the ancient Roman society. But he said, I want you to list everything that Jesus went through, and presumably you understand, for you people in Rome, and for us as well. And then I want you to list on the other side, so Jesus on one side and you on the other side. Write down what you, and put together a sheet that has on one side the sufferings of Jesus, on the other their own sufferings. And frankly, the point he's trying to make is they don't compare. It's not even close. The sufferings of Jesus far outmatch anything that you're experiencing at this point. And so consider him who endured hostility by sinners against himself. And he says, why do you do that? So that you don't grow weary and lose heart. And you have to remember that in chapter 11, that you have all of these people who have run the race, because that's the idiom that is in 11 and 12. that all these people who have run the race successfully, that is, they did it and they made it to the end. And as I mentioned last night, I got to be honest, there's some people in that list that I struggle with, that he included them. But that's something I'll have to take up with the writer of Hebrews someday. But the idea is, because some of those people, like Gideon, I don't know about that. But the point is, they ran the race, they made it to the end. And then he says, look at Jesus, ran the race and made it to the end. You are now in the midst of the race, people of Hebrews. Will you be able to make it to the end? That's the whole point. And the idea, throughout the Old Testament, the idea of harvest and the kingdom, and this is what he's laid before them, is all this joy set before him, like he said in chapter 2, and what he's going to talk about today, he's going to talk about life and holiness, is that in the Old Testament, the picture of the kingdom was all about harvest. Because when you live in an agrarian society, again, like Wenatchee, at least at that point, when you're working all of this time in anticipation of the harvest, the joy came at the harvest time because the hard work was over, at least for a momentary piece of time. So it's obvious when the prophets write about this coming kingdom that God is going to get, it's always connected to some kind of a harvest festival, or many times it is. And so that's the picture that the writer is using throughout this, is that this joy of the harvest that's going to come. And if you want to participate in that harvest festival, that kingdom that's coming, that is written about throughout Hebrews, you got to finish the race. You got to make it. So he says, consider him who endured hostility so that you don't grow weary and lose heart. Literally, it's lose soul. Heart has a different connotation, and I'm not comfortable with the interpretation. I know what they're trying to do, but heart has the connotation of volition in Scripture, because that's in making choices. But soul is everything about who you are. And Aristotle used this same phrase when he was writing about athletes, that an athlete who collapses, exhausted at the finish line, same phrase. So what the writer is saying, using this phrase, is by considering Jesus and lining up everything that Jesus did on one side and whatever you're experiencing on your side, and you compare them, that's going to help you so that you don't fall exhausted in the middle of the race and never finish. This, and you've seen that in athletic events. So again, the idea is that we don't want you to fall exhausted. We don't want you to stop in the middle of the race completely wiped out because of the trials you're going through. And we'll speak more about that in just a moment. And then he goes on to say, you've not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood. A couple of things. One, Jesus did, right? So in that comparison that they're drawing, Jesus was beaten, Jesus died, Jesus, all of that. They've not resisted. But notice what he says. You've not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood. He's not saying that it might be a real possibility in the future. And again, if you know the history of Rome at this point, whenever this was written, Nero and others after this was a very difficult time for Christians living in Rome. And so the not yet makes it clear that it may be. As we saw in chapter 11 a couple of weeks ago, when the writer is talking about people who ran the race, and remember, he gets to that switch and he says, oh yeah, and some were sawn in two, and this and this and this. He talks about people who suffered and died. The end of their race was martyrdom itself. And he says, look, you've not yet suffered at that point, but it may be a real possibility for you. But in doing so, you're comparing yourself to the sufferings of Jesus in your striving against sin. So you've not yet suffered death in your striving against sin. Jesus endured against sinners. They were striving against sin. And the idea, the sinners in sin, Jesus being perfect did not struggle with sin, right? As we think of it. Because when we think of sin, we understand sin is a part of who I am, as who you are as well. Sin is the outer world in which I live, the world as John calls it in his epistles, but it's also the evil forces that exist in this world. As Paul would say in Ephesians 6, you wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. That although sometimes enemies present themselves as human, there's something behind that. But Jesus didn't wrestle like that. He wrestled against sinners, right? We struggle and strive against sin. our own selves. And the very fact that, like, if the Hebrews choose to abandon Christ at this point and go back to Judaism, that is sin. Unbelief is sin. And they're struggling with that. And the point there, the striving word, he switches the metaphors, which is very common in Greek. Unfortunately, it's not good in English, right? We're not supposed to mix our metaphors. He's been talking about a race, and now he says, in your striving, and the word striving was a word when you would be in an altercation with somebody face to face. And so in your striving, in your contending against sin, and sin is seen as this incredible opponent of which we're fighting. And they're struggling. And so part of what he wanted them to do was to think about Jesus, consider Jesus and everything he did so you don't grow weary in your striving against sin. Sin is represented as an aggressive opponent. Again, much like Paul, as I mentioned, our battle against evil is at times presents itself to humans, but it also reflects our own human battle against sin. That striving, much like Paul in 1 Corinthians 9. I beat myself black and blue, lest after I've preached to others how to run the race, I might be disqualified. Paul struggled with the exact same thing that the Hebrews were struggling with in the fact that he said, look, I discipline myself to such an extent because if I fail to finish the race, I'm disqualified. And, I've seen some commentators say, well, it means he's not going to get a prize, like he won't get 5 crowns, he'll only get 4 crowns or what. No, if you're disqualified from the race, you don't finish, right? You don't cross the finish line. And that's what Paul is saying. And that's what the writer of Hebrews is saying here, is that if you don't finish the race by considering Jesus and all the things that he did and know that you're struggling against sin, if you don't finish, there's no reward for you. There's no fruit of harvest at the end. So consider Jesus. The next thing he's going to say is consider yourselves as sons of the living God. And he's going to be talking about discipline. And this is not discipline like disciplining yourself. Like, I want to be disciplined. I want to be more disciplined. I'm not going to eat sugar, or I'm not going to whatever. That's a different word. This is the word paideia, which is the idea of a father disciplining his children. And the picture in Greek is the same as it was in Hebrew. The picture is that whatever you're doing, the point of it looks not at what you do, it looks at the results of what you're doing. So discipline and instruction are oftentimes connected together. They're in Ephesians 6. Fathers, bring your children up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Same word. So it's instruction, it's education. And so the end result is what the writer is looking at this word, not whatever is going on. And so when we're going to talk about this discipline, it only occurs 4 times in this text, 6 times in the whole New Testament in this particular form. And the other 2 times I just mentioned, one in Ephesians 6. The other one is 2 Timothy 3:16. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God breathed and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, and instruction in righteousness. Exact same word. So it's looking at the end result. So keep that in mind as we look through this. So consider yourselves sons of the living God. Let me go back. Have you not forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons? So he's coming back, and now he's talking about considering Jesus and considering yourselves as sons of the living God. So you've forgotten, and it could be, and notice that I have a period and a question mark. It could be either in the original. Whatever it is an admonition to these people. Have you forgotten what God said to you as sons? Or you've forgotten what God said to you as sons, but the meaning's the same. And what he's going to do, he's going to quote from Proverbs chapter 3. And a couple of things. One is the idea of inerrancy, that God is the one, even though Solomon wrote this book, God is the one speaking. So again, there's a little play on inspiration there. But also to the idea that, again, all Scripture is inspired by God, is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, that Proverbs 3 is just as meaningful to the people in Rome as it is to us today. So he's going to be quoting from Proverbs chapter 3, verses 11 to 12. He says, have you forgotten? You've completely forgotten. is the idea, what God has said to you. And in 3:11 and 12 is in the middle of, because when you think of the book of Proverbs, you usually think of the wise man does this, but the foolish man does this, right? These little short little ditties, these pithy statements. But actually the first 9 chapters is a series of songs, beautiful songs, where the wisdom lady is paired against the adulterous woman. And the idea is it's wisdom and foolishness. God's way, the way of Yahweh, and the way of the world. And they're pitted against each other throughout these nine chapters. And at the beginning of this, when Solomon wrote the book of Proverbs, if indeed he did, and I do believe he did, it was originally addressed to sons. It was how to train your sons to be good, righteous rulers in the kingdom. And so this was part of it. And there's Proverbs throughout the ancient Near East, much like this at the same period of time. And so when Solomon wrote this, it was addressed to his sons, but now the writer of Hebrews is saying, look, you are also sons of God, and so the meaning of this passage is just as meaningful to you as it was to the sons of Solomon. So have you addressed, it was addressed to you. And the result is, and this is where that paideia, that word for discipline, the end result of paideia is wisdom. And Proverbs like Job and Song of Songs and the others in that wisdom literature. Wisdom literature was a style of literature that was throughout the ancient Near East, but in Israel, it was a way to train your children and others in the way of Yahweh, in the law. And so wisdom, the word wisdom is not as most people think. I've heard it said like wisdom is, like knowledge is knowing what to do and wisdom is putting it into practice. That's not biblical wisdom. The word actually comes from the carpenters, and it was a skill that you would learn. The word chokmah, and so it became the idea of a skill in living. So it was training yourself, much like you would learn a skill. It was training yourself in the way of Yahweh, because some of the things that we believe to be true, like don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, those are not always the easiest course for us as humans. Am I not right? Oh, come on. No, it's not, right? It's difficult at times. And so we have to train ourselves. And when I became a believer, I still had echoes of my old life that were still a part in ways I had trained myself prior to coming to Christ. Those echoes were still a very large part of my life. And so part of disciplining ourselves is working our ways away from those echoes that's a part of our lives. And so wisdom is the training, the skill of living the way of Yahweh. That's the book of Proverbs. And so he's going to be talking about discipline as he quotes from Proverbs. But before we do that, because we're going to be talking about discipline and trials and suffering that we have as Christians. And so I want to take just a quick side note. Why do we suffer as humans? Because again, ideally, I can still remember years and years ago being taught that, hey, when you become a Christian, like, it's all roses after that. Like nothing ever bad happens and life goes on and everybody's happy and it's like everybody's singing. It's like Oliver Twist. They're all singing down the streets. And it's not like that. We all experience bumps in the road and sometimes those bumps are huge, right? So why do we suffer? If indeed I love Jesus and God loves me, life should go well, right? Do you not think that? Do you experience it? No. So why do we suffer? 3. 1, we live in a fallen, broken world. This world is broken. And because of sin, this is not the way God intended life to be. So we get cancer. There's earthquakes. There's windstorms. And you fill in the blank. And part of it is just the fact we live in a broken world. That is the result of our choices way back when. But we live in a fallen, broken world. And guess what? If the big one happens in Seattle, your homes are going down just like mine. Like, wouldn't it be cool, though, if, like, everybody's house except for ours, like, all the Christians' homes just sat there and like, sorry, like, you're pagans. Like, I'm sorry. But it's not going to happen. We're going down. Because when bad things happen, we experience it as well. And we just live in a broken world. And genetically, Like if I'm predisposed towards a given cancer, I may get it as much as I'm striving. Like it's colon cancer in my family, so I do everything I can to make sure that doesn't happen. But because it's a predisposition, my father died of it, and so but we live in a broken, fallen world, and bad things happen. The second one is we sin, and then we suffer the consequences of the choices that we make. Then we blame God, but we suffer the choices that we make. And when you think of it, because oftentimes we think, well, excuse me, but like I asked forgiveness. But understand that forgiveness has to do with the penalty of sin, not the consequence of sin. When David sinned with Bathsheba, and he murdered Uriah, and he slept with Bathsheba, and did all of those horrible things, and then when Nathan confronts him, and David presumably, there's nothing in the text about it, but in my Hollywood ending to the story, David repents, which we see in Psalm 51, offers a sacrifice, because David deserved to die. He did. That was a punishable by death offense. But he doesn't. And he doesn't not because he's king. Presumably he doesn't because he offers a sacrifice, and the guilt of that sin was removed by the sacrifice. But remember what Nathan said to him right after that? But because you did this, your house is never going to know peace. So for the rest of your life, if you read the rest of Samuel, like David's family is like a soap opera, like people killing and sleeping and all these horrible things because of David's choice. So at times, the bad things that happen to us in life is because we sinned and we're receiving the consequence of the choices that we make. And like I said a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's true, and then we blame God. Why is this happening to me? When in reality, I kind of did it to myself. And then the third one, which is the one that we're looking at today, is God allows at times suffering and hardship because he loves us. So he allows things into our lives at times, suffering and hardship, not because he hates us, but rather because he loves us and not only wants to make it to the end, but he wants to heighten our immediate relationship with him. So the suffering that we endure as Christians, when God allows it into our lives, if indeed it isn't because what I did, and it's not because I just live in a fallen world, the suffering that God allows into my life at times is because he loves us. And he loves me so much, he wants me to finish the race, and he wants to heighten that relationship that I have with him right now. So in the light of that, how do we respond when discipline happens? When I evaluate it, I'm like, okay, like I haven't sinned. Like think of Job. This is, Job fits into this perfectly. First part of Job, God and Satan are like sitting around talking and saying, hey, look, God starts the conversation, which is kind of crazy. Hey, look at my man Job. Like, he's pretty good. Satan's like, yeah, that's because he's got everything he wants. Watch, if you take that away. And so God doesn't take it away, but he allows Satan to take it away, right? One by one. And Satan, and throughout the book of Job, Job is arguing his innocence, right? Until, of course, he meets God, and he says, oh, yeah, never mind. But he argues his innocence throughout the book. He's evaluated in his own life, says, look, I've done nothing that I should receive this. And so, again, this is the trial from God. So 3 responses, and it's going to come from Proverbs chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. The first response is when we experience trial in our lives, the first response is to take it lightly. So Proverbs chapter 3, verse 11, my son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord. Especially in our times, we may ignore it, we may dismiss it, we may misinterpret it, and the hardships which God allows in our lives. And because of that, we miss his message to us and fail to continue in our growth to maturity. God allows adversity in our lives, much like the message of James, to grow us and produce the endurance in us to make it to the end. What happens is, oftentimes in our 2017 American Christianity, when we start experiencing trials and tribulations, our first response is to do what? God, take this away from me. Like, why are you doing this to me? Like, this is not what I signed on for. You promised that everything would be roses, right? We argue with God to take it away because it's painful. The writer's going to say that in just a moment. It's not good. It doesn't feel good. It is good. It just doesn't feel good. So to regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, to take it, to scorn it, to make light of it. And so the idea is that again, they were struggling with their faith, and they're trying, and rather than work through the issue in Hebrews, they're just going to blow it all together and just leave it completely. So he's looking at the people of Hebrews and said, look, your first response to what's going on right now, if indeed this is discipline of the Lord, is to blow it off. Not a big deal. I'm just going to, if this is the way it's going to be, I'm just going to do whatever I'm going to do anyway. The second response that we can have when we experience the trials, nor faint when you are reproved by him. So again, this is that synonymous Hebrew poetry. But the idea is to faint is to give out, to become weary. It's the same word that was used in verse 3 of losing heart. And so the idea is that when I experience trials, I don't just blow it off. I become so self-absorbed, so self-consumed, I literally fall down in the middle of the race, exhausted, and I give up. That's a second response. We just jettison God, which is what the Hebrews were going to do. Like, we're just going to give up. And I'm done with this race because this race isn't what I signed on for. And so the second response, or faint when you are reproved by him. C.S. Lewis, you may or may not know, he wrote this book under a pseudonym to begin with. And somebody asked me last night, why do you think he wrote it as a pseudonym? And I think it's because he knew when people read this that they would be worried about him and about all the things that he had mentioned. Because as you know, if you've ever watched the movie Shadowlands or read the book, C.S. Lewis got married late in life and married a woman who almost immediately develops cancer and dies very shortly. They were not together very long. So he journaled his experience after that, and it's called A Grief Observed. And he's writing about his feelings of God. Now, I have to tell you, C.S. Lewis comes back, but in the beginning of that, this is what he said. Meanwhile, where is God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms. When you are happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing him, so happy that you are tempted to feel his claims upon you are an interruption. If you remember yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and where do you find? A door slammed in your face. A sound of bolting and double bolting from the inside. After that, silence. You might as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. There are no lights in the windows. It might be an empty house. Was it ever inhabited? It seems so once, and that seeming was so strong as this. What can this mean? Why is he, that is God, so present a commander in our time of prosperity and so very absent a help in our time of trouble? Have you ever felt like that? When you're undergoing trials and you go to God and it feels like he double bolted the door and no one's there and he doesn't hear you. That's the second response. That we see the trial as what's happening to me. Because again, I can look at it as the event, or I can look at it, remember with paideia, the discipline, I can look at the result of the event. And oftentimes we get stuck on the event and not what God is trying to produce in us. That's discipline. And that's the third response that we can have. For those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines. Like James, we should be happy, at least joyful. Not happy in the modern sense of the term, this pleasurable sense of satisfaction, but joyful. Again, content, that's the idea. That even in the midst of trials, James says, count it all joy when you experience various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces, same word, endurance. Again, making it to the end. So like James, we should be joyful when undergoing trials, for it ensures us that indeed we are children of God. We accept the trials as an instrument of God to help us grow in our maturity and strengthen our resolve to make it to the end. What the writer says is, look, rather than focusing on the trial and the event that's taking place in your life, look at the outcome. Focus on the outcome. If nothing else, focus on the kingdom and where that's going to bring you, rather than on the event. So verse 6, for those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines. God disciplines us and trains us not out of our need, or not out of his need, but out of ours. Without discipline, we become complacent and apathetic, and we believe that all is well, when in reality we are stagnant and unproductive in our need to mature and endure. It's an expression. Discipline is an expression of relationship, of a God who loves us enough, cares about us enough to discipline us to get us to the end of the race. And then the flip side, and he scourges every son whom he receives. I was telling the group last night, when I was a kid growing up in Wenatchee, I made the statement that, it takes a village. Like, that was Wenatchee well before Hillary wrote that book. Like, you could do nothing wrong in my neighborhood that not only did your neighbor spank you, and then call your parents, and my mom would then say, okay, yeah, we'll spank him when we get home too. But they would rat you out. Like, you could do nothing in Wenatchee that the whole neighborhood did not know who you were, what you were doing, and that you weren't supposed to be doing that. And so that's the idea, is that God is disciplining us and has that care for us. That training or discipline is given only to legitimate children, which he'll mention in just a second. It's interesting that we're taking communion today, because in that 1 Corinthians passage, we never read this part at communion. We always read the stuff right before it. But in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul he uses this same word, except in the verb form. And he's talked about, eating and drinking the cup and all the things that we usually quote. And then he talks about the fact that don't take it, unjustly or unrightly. This is the reason why many are sick. Verse 32, but when we are judged, we are disciplined by the Lord in order that we may not be condemned along with the world. In other words, when we're disciplined, which is taking place in the Corinthian church at that point, God's doing that so that when the world is condemned, that is, in the fiery conflagration at the end of the world, you're not with them. So God disciplines us again for our need, not out of his need. And he scourges every son whom he receives. So then what the author does now, in the following verses, in 7 through 11, is he gives an exposition of that Proverbs passage. And he's going to talk about the fact that, hey, this is the way sonship and fatherhood work. And he's going to compare your earthly father to your heavenly father in almost every verse. So verse 7, it is for discipline that you endure. God deals with you as son. For what son is there whom the father does not discipline? But if you're without discipline, of which all have become partakers, then you're illegitimate children and not sons. So it's for discipline that you endure. And I was mentioning again last night, this phrase is very difficult in the original language, and I still don't know what it means, at least precisely the grammatical construction. But the joy is neither did anyone else that I read. So I'm good. Like I used to tell students in my class at the seminary, get used to these three words and use them all the time. I don't know. And be good with that. There are times you just have to say, I don't know, or I don't have enough data to give you an answer. But the idea is that there's a connection between discipline and endurance. That's clear. I just don't know how it all fits grammatically. So when you are disciplined, it's the fact that God is trying to give you to the point of endurance. How one interprets and receives the suffering and trials determines the efficacy of that said trial. Again, if I see it as God punishing me, which God, again, allowing discipline because he loves us to make it to the end. But if I see it in the negative framework, I'm going to take it as negative. But if I see it as in a positive framework, I'm more apt to see it in a positive light, especially as what is producing in me. So at first they're called to remember Christ's sufferings and to look on him. Now they're to remember the fatherhood of God in their times of suffering. So God deals with you as sons. And the idea of son in the ancient Greek world is a bit weird. It's very dissimilar to what we understand today. The father in the family had complete control over the family, even their sons. And whatever they said went. And so the oldest male in the family had complete control over the family, even to the point that they could execute capital punishment on their own children. We don't know how many times that ever happened, but it was part of the law. Eventually, it became part. That was written out. But the other part is that even if you had possessions as a son, your father owned them, and he would let you use them. So this is sonship. And keep that in mind in the Greco-Roman world, because that's going to be very dissimilar to God's father-son relationship. And he'll point that out. The other thing, too, is, with the modern, gender-neutral Bibles and all of this, people are saying, well, they should say sons and daughters, realistically, because daughters should be of equal importance to the sons. You didn't want to be a daughter in the Greco-Roman world. It's probably good that you mentioned that you're sons, because as a daughter, you had nothing to these people. Matter of fact, most daughters, when you gave birth to a daughter, they were killed. And so sons only received the inheritance. So in a sense, the writer of Hebrews is actually uplifting women in this passage, as Paul does in Ephesians as well, and giving them a status which was absolutely unknown in the world. You'll be treated as a son, which is a good thing, because only sons receive the inheritance. But the fathers controlled everything. So he says, for what son is there whom the father does not discipline? Good question, rhetorical question. As a father, I realize that our children are not born tabula rasa, which was the medieval times. The kids are born a clean slate. That's not true. You find that out the first 10 minutes after they're born. And it's interesting that most of the guys who believed in tabula rasa were monks. They never had kids. So of course they would think that. Gosh. But they're not born, but they are born naive. Thinking back to the book of Proverbs, there were 3 people in Proverbs. There was the wise, the fool, and the naive one. The wise was the one who knew what to do and did it. The fool was the one who knew what to do and didn't do it. The naive one is the one who just doesn't know. And there were many examples of which I won't bring up any of my sons, but there are many examples of which my job was to teach them what to do. Because some of them are pretty basic, but some of them are a little bit more refined. That's discipline in trying to bring my child up in a respectable way, and he's done okay. But anyway, so what son is whom the father does not discipline? Rhetorical question. Of course we do, because we have something about our children we want. But if you're without discipline, of which all have become partakers, and again he's talking about the culture here, you're illegitimate children. And understand, in the Roman society, if you were illegitimate, you got nothing. You were not part of the inheritance. You got none of the promises. You got nothing. And so what the writer is trying to say is, you want to be disciplined. You really want that. It's not like I'm going to seek it out, God, give me another. Or Captain Brown, Captain Brown in the movie Forrest Gump. Is that the best you can do, God? As he's on top of the mast of the ship. That's not what we're talking about. But if you're without discipline, you're not a son. You get nothing at the end. And so what the writer is trying to reframe in their minds, you want to be disciplined. You want it when it happens. And again, it doesn't mean you're going to like it. He's going to say it. But if you're without it, you're not a true son. And as such, you receive none of the Father's inheritance, no reward. You won't finish the line. There'll be no joy of harvest. So we want the discipline. Again, I'm not going to go looking for it, but when it comes, I'm going to take it as what it is, as an act of a loving God who loves me so much, he wants to see me one day and not judge me with the rest of the world, as he said in Corinthians. He said, furthermore, you had earthly fathers to discipline us, going on with this argument, and we respected them. Shall we not much rather be subject to the Father of spirits and live? So we all had earthly fathers, and we respected them. And again, he's talking to the Hebrews. And so some of you are thinking back to your dad, and you're like, yeah, I don't think so. But understand, generally speaking, because that's what he's doing here, not saying that every dad was a perfect paragon of virtue, but he says, generally speaking, we had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected that. If that's true, lesser argument to the greater, if that's true, how much more should we respect and be subject to the Father of spirits? The word earthly fathers there is fleshly fathers, fathers of the flesh, Father of the Spirit, and live. And again, he keeps going back to that end result of discipline. And live means not just living life well now, but that I get to live with Christ forever and God forever. It's a plus deal. And so, if we respected our earthly fathers who disciplined us, how much more would we respect our heavenly Father who disciplines us? And the result is we get to live. For they disciplined us for a short time, as seemed best to them. But he disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. And again, why submission to God is better than submission to our earthly fathers? When our fathers disciplined us, it was for their good. And again, in the Roman law, your job of disciplining your children was to raise good, reflective Roman citizens. That was the point. And so the fathers had an obligation to raise good Roman citizens. And it was for them. It was for the family. And he says, look, they disciplined us for a short time, what seemed good to them. But God disciplines us, and the point is not short time, but now and into eternity, for our good, that we may share in his holiness. See the distinction? Fathers did it for their own self. So the family looked good. I can still remember a couple of times when my dad would say, hey, look, what you're doing right now reflects on the family. Like the family Stufflebeam name, which there's not a lot of us. And I don't think really people cared. But what I did reflected on the good family name. What God does is for me, to grow me into what I need to be, so that I can then share in his holiness. Unlike our earthly fathers, where the discipline was a reflection on him, our heavenly Father's discipline is to help us to become a reflection of him. Does that make sense? Just a switch of preposition. Unlike our earthly fathers, where the discipline was a reflection on him, that is on my dad, our heavenly Father's discipline is to help us to become a reflection of him. Holiness. Be holy, just like I am holy. That's what I'm supposed to be. That's what you're supposed to be. And there's no outsies. There's like, yeah, be holy as much as you can. I know you're human. Good luck. Hope you can make it. That's not how God says it. It's like when you look at your life, it should look like God's life. And that's part of what discipline does. It helps root out some of those echoes of our past life that is not a reflection of God and is not a way of serving God, and nor is it holiness. Then verse 11. All discipline for the moment seems to be joyful, or does not seem to be joyful, but sorrowful. Yet to those who've been trained by it, afterward it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Beautiful verse. Again, no discipline. Again, if you come to me and say, hey, you know what, God's disciplining me, and it feels good, like I really like it. No, it's not joyful. It's sorrowful. It hurts. Again, if it doesn't, it's probably not discipline, right? Like the old adage, this hurts me more than it hurts you. I never bought that. I got to be honest. I never bought it. But the idea is that, look, for the moment, it doesn't feel good, but it is good. Do you notice this? You see the distinction? It's not supposed to feel good. It's to make me realize that what I'm doing right now is not right. And that I've got to stop doing what I'm doing and come back to that relationship with God so that I can discipline that out of my life. So it's not joyful, but sorrowful. Remember Jesus, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despised the shame, sat down at the right hand of God. Yet those who've been trained by it, here's the word, the discipline word, gymnazo, which literally means to exercise naked, which is what they did back in the ancient world. But it's the idea of training. Exercise, the same word that he uses in chapter 5 of Hebrews. But solid food is for the mature, who have trained their senses to discern good and evil. Same word. That this is that discipline part of ourselves where I'm rooting out those things in my life that ought not to be there as followers and sons of the living God. That I am to be a reflection of the very Father whom we serve. And when I do it, and I've been trained by it, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. And the original language here is very convoluted. Again, in English, we always do subject, verb, predicate, right? That's just common. John went to the store. Greek, you can do whatever you want. You can put whatever word you want whenever you want it. And as I was mentioning in Ephesians chapter 2, 1 through 10, which is one long sentence in Greek, like the verb doesn't even occur to verse 4. Like you don't even know what's going to happen till verse 4. It's just the way they write. And so the way this is written, it's like peaceful fruit, subject, all of this, and then the word righteousness occurs at the very end all by itself. Because when the writer consistently throughout the book of Hebrews has always, when he gets to the end of the section and he wants to emphasize something, he puts it at the very end, which is very common, a literary device. I'm going to emphasize righteousness. That the whole point of discipline is to get us to the joy of the harvest, right? The propping and the thinning and the pruning and all of the things that are difficult to do to get us to the joy of the harvest. And the hard work of discipline gets us to that peaceful fruit of righteousness, holiness, being who we are, not only in this life, in the life to come. The word peaceful means that things are right, like we're good, like God and I are good. So what? So when we undergo trials, our first reaction is often to question God. Why are you doing this? Where are you? And when there is only silence, we begin to question the love of God. And frankly, at times, our own love for Him. Right? The Hebrews were doing it, and they're nothing different than us. We begin to question the love of God and our own love for Him. What this section of text teaches us, and understand it is purposely connected to verses 1 and 2, is that all of these questions about God have already been answered for us in the person of Jesus Christ. Like when it feels like God is silent, and I've been there and so have you. When you feel like God is silent, understand, does God love us? Yes, Jesus. Does God have an ultimate purpose for our life? Yeah, Jesus. Why does God allow bad things to happen? He allowed them to happen to His own Son so that He could experience it like us, yet without sin. And when God is silent, or at least seemingly so, because I don't think that He is, Jesus' acts, His life, His death, His resurrection, screams the answer. That's the truth. So I want to ask two questions. And I'm looking at my time. Okay. So what if you were given the power of God for 24 hours? What would you do? I really want you to think about that. If you were given the very power of God, you can do anything. What would you do? Again, I work in education, and one of the things that we do is called cooperative learning. So turn to your partner, because that's what we do in school. Turn to your partner and tell them what you would do if you were given the power of God. Someone sitting next to you, what would you do? All right, next question. How would that change if you were given the wisdom of God? If you knew the outcome of the choice that you just made? How would that change? You can turn to your partner again and you can partner share. How would that change? If you had the wisdom of God, how would that change if you had the power of God? So the last thing I want to do is just a quick evaluation. I didn't put this on the slide. But what if trials do come? What do we do? Like how do we handle that? if indeed they do come, and they will come. I shouldn't say if they come, it's when they come. So when suffering comes, the first step is to evaluate it. Like, what's going on right now in my life? What is happening? Is it me? Is it something that I've done that's caused this to happen? Like, that's what Job did, right? Like, he went back and reevaluated. Like, I didn't do this, I didn't do this, I didn't know. Like, I'm good. Is it the world? Is it just happened because we live in a broken world? Or could it possibly be from God? If I eliminate the first two, it may be a blessing of God, working in your life to grow you into what to be. And again, embrace it and try to understand. That's number two. If that's true, reframe your thinking in keeping with the proposed outcome. Knowing that if indeed it is an act of God working in your life, allowing things in your life to grow you into maturity, embrace it. And say, okay, what do I need to learn from this, God? Make it really clear. And then do it. Reframe your thinking instead of, this is all about me, woe me, everybody hates me, nobody likes me, God's gone. Instead of being focused on myself and growing weary and drop dead before the end of the race, reframe it. What is God trying to do to grow me into what I need to be so I make it to the end? Number three, change what you need to change. If there's something that is an echo of your past that needs to be eliminated, eliminate it. If there's something that you need to grow into a gift or whatever, to grow into more usage, do it. Whatever it needs, change what you need to change. Number four, continue to reframe your thinking from the immediate to eternity. Like, whatever is taking place in your life is short-lived, even if it takes place now until the end of your breath. Because eternity far outdistance any time this drop of bucket that we're here on this earth. And again, I would rather have eternity than that. And then the last one, remember Jesus' suffering. Remember what Jesus did for you and what he endured for you, and add it up. Make the same Jesus in me list. I'm going to close with this. Sharon and I have a really good friend who, I said 2 years, it's been a little bit longer than that, but several years ago developed stage 4 breast cancer. Young girl, just got married, had only been married like a couple of years. Developed stage 4 breast cancer. Was not given a great prognosis at the beginning, but she went through all of this. I mean, it's still going through. I mean, she's gone through surgeries and chemo and all of these things. And has given up, the thought of having children and all of the things that are a part of what that does. And I interviewed her in a sermon about 1.5 years ago. And it was a part of a sermon from James, so it fits a bit with this. But I interviewed her and we talked about all the things that she went through and what she learned. But the last question I asked her was, would you do it again? She said, didn't even blink an eye. Absolutely. She would not give up that experience and all the things she went through. She would not in a heartbeat give that up for the relationship that she has with God today. That's that mentality. And that's a tough one to come to because, again, nobody likes it. All suffering seems sorrowful. And all of the pain of things that she's going to experience the rest of her life because of that, she wouldn't give it up. Because it grew her into the person that she needed to be. And her relationship with God is far greater than it would ever have been without that. Father, we thank you that you are a great God and we love you. Lord, and we know that you love us. And although it doesn't feel like it sometimes, God, we know that you do. And I pray that you will guide each one of us as we look at our own lives and evaluate the things that you do in our lives to bring us to a place, Father, where we can see and know and love you in return in all of those ways. We thank you, Father. Amen.